Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa of the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him. And while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So let's tie that back to history. Here's this guy. He is still upset that the Greeks had defeated his dad at Marathon, and he wants to go and get them. And so he's raising his army, he's raising his nobles, he's raising the rich guys of the empire, and saying, let's form this coalition, let's go after them. So 180 days, half a year, they're partying. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days. So 187 days back to back of partying. I went to a birthday party yesterday, and the strongest thing that I drank was water with a little bit of lemon in it, and I'm exhausted. I can't imagine these guys 187 days into it. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. They're suggesting here that of all those people that showed up, no 2 cups were identical. Now, there's a place north of here in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, called the Asa Packer Mansion. And I was told that when you go into that foyer, there are little rosettes carved into the ceiling, and there are hundreds of them, and no 2 rosettes are the same. I don't know how many cups they had, and they weren't carving in wood. They were making the stuff out of gold, and there are different kinds of gold. And the drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. So I don't know if you ever went to an affair or a wedding where there's an open bar. Some people like me, H2O. Other people, they want to get their money's worth. And I expect this party was no different. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Why do you think she had a party for the women? Any thoughts?
Probably kept the wives occupied while the husbands were drinking.
Okay,
with the king.
kept the wives occupied.
I mean, whatever the king is doing is for the men trying to build up an army and the rest of that. So the women have to be kept occupied and happy.
And if they're going to be pulled out for 180 days, you got to do something to, as you said, keep the women occupied. On the 7th day, this is the 187th day of the party, and keep in mind now, this is not in front of the nobles, this is in front of the common people. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Beztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Haggotha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. Now, my contention is that she was asked to come with the crown, and that was all, because she wasn't coming to show off her robes. The king wanted her to come and show off her body. Well, Vashti was not only beautiful to look at, she had some common sense. She did not want to parade herself in front of other people, and she had to pay the price. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Why did his anger burn within him?
He was king, and all had all authority, and he was very well embarrassed.
He was embarrassed. Old pride got in his way again. He was enraged and his anger burned within him. We're going to see where Ahasuerus has an anger problem. When Vashti is done away with and he gets his coalition, even though she embarrassed him, and they have that battle with Salamis, and he loses that battle, we're going to read, and when his anger subsided, he kept his fury for a long, long time. So he was not a happy camper. So there's acrostic number 1 from verse 20. All the women will respect. Now, Romans tells us this: pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. You want respect? Give some away. What's going to happen here will be the council is going to say, make a law, king, that the women have to respect your husbands. Well, if they're going to do it because there's a law, they might go through the motions, but in the brain, there's no respect going on. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times. Now, this is also very interesting because this is the last time in the book of Esther where the king is conferring with his wise men. I think what happened was the wise men actually put the king in trouble because he needed his queen. What we're going to see when he comes back is he's not going to confer with the wise men. He's going to confer with the young men, and we'll expand on that when we get there. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and judgment, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti? Everything is done according to the law. Keep in mind, once the Medes and the Persians set down a law, it could not be repealed. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti? Because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Then Memucan, which means impoverished. Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, from India to Ethiopia. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women. Well, yeah, because there were the common people were there, and they see the queen. Well, they don't see the queen, but they recognize that the queen's not coming. What are they going to do when they go home? You can't believe what Vashti did to the king. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at the husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty.
I think that's more where Mocan and the officials were concerned with their own family, with their own wives and their obedience.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And we're going to see a phrase a little bit later on. It's not in the scripture. It's JTSV. Wait till Mocan gets home. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. Comes from Proverbs. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. It turns it wherever he will. Let's think about that. If the king hadn't put Vashti out, there'd be no Esther. There may still have been a Mordecai, and there may still have been the edict of Haman to kill all the Jews. But it was Esther who went to the king and told the king about Mordecai uncovering the plot. It could very well have been that if Vashti had not been put out, if Esther had not been put in, that Haman could have succeeded in wiping out the Jews, and that would have wiped out the bloodline of Jesus. So the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So here they are, drunked up. Memucan says, let's do this thing. And so what happens? He sends out the letters to every province. And so what happens? The party's over. At least the ladies' party is over. She's, don't know if they turned off the party, if they put her in the tower. You know, I think about Henry VIII and what happened to some of his wives. The party's over. For Memucan, wait till Memucan gets home, right? His missus is not going to be a happy camper. Xerxes gets his funding. He goes to war and loses to the Greeks. 4 years transpire because Esther chapter 2 starts off after these things. 3 years to go to battle and come back angry and depressed. 1 year for the virgins to prepare, and Esther comes to the king. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal presence in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So you see that block of time that goes by, and we're going to break that down a little bit more. So Esther 2 starts off, and the question is, just another day? And here are some other just another days. There was Noah, 120 years building the ark, 7 days locked up, and the drops of rain start. The last day of Sodom. Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, as it was the days of Lot, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Just another day. Moses spent 40 years taking care of his father-in-law's sheep, and it was just another day when he saw the burning bush. David was taking care of his dad's sheep, and Samuel comes to town. And he says, we're not going to sit down until we see every one of Jesse's sons. Just another day, the birth of Christ. Bethlehem was filled with all kinds of people that had to come to pay their taxes, so there was no room for them in the inn. Just another day when Jesus rose from the dead. The Pharisees, the chief priests, they were satisfied. Jesus was in the tomb was sealed, the soldiers were watching, they're having their rest. It's the day after the Sabbath, just another day. And the coming of Jesus Christ will be just another day. We'll be doing whatever that we're doing, and Jesus is going to come back. And it was just another day. I say here, Esther enters a beauty pageant. I should have said Esther is entered into a beauty pageant, because the Bible never says she volunteered for that situation. After these things, there we see that verse we just covered, and now we're going to take a look at the timeline. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all the officials. That's how we started off in chapter 1. He had the loss of Salamis. He spent the women spent 12 months in the body shop. We're going to see that verse shortly. Let's face it, the conveniences that are around our house did not exist just a short time ago. It wasn't until after World War II, when there was a degree of affluence into the country, the costs of products were coming down. Mass production was started by Henry Ford much earlier, but now is being applied to all kinds of different inventions like toasters and ovens, and more recently microwaves, washing machines and drying machines, even though the Amish still use the most modern technology, solar and wind, to dry their clothes. It was hard on the households back then, and they had to go into the body shop. 12 months of all kinds of salves and perfumes, work the calluses off their hands, maybe work the tummy tuck, whatever they had to do, 12 months in the body shop. And then a certain window of time when every one of those virgins was taken to the king. And I have the double there because we'll see us shortly that they may have gone through there a second round. So we go from the 3rd year to the 7th year, 4 years in the making. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king." Now, ESV says young men, attendants say NIV, and servants says the King James. So which is it? You got to go back, and there you see Na'ar, a boy, an adolescent, a young man. And if you look at the times Na'ar is used in scripture, the vast majority of times it's translated as boy or lad or young man, and seldom simply servant. So you have a young man. The king is going to the young men for counsel. Now, we have this phrase, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Sometimes goals are set based upon the lenses of the person setting the goal. What did these young men have to think about? There's the king, there's his harem, and what do you think the king wants? Well, a young man would be thinking in terms of what the young man wants. So the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king." There is another time in scripture where the king went to the young men versus to his council. Rehoboam. The people of the northern tribe said, your dad has taxed us way too much. What are you going to do? He said, "Give me some time to think about it." He goes to his council. His council said, "Cut them a break." But he goes to the young men, and the young men said, "Oh, no." They said, "If we want to continue our lifestyle, we need that cash flow. So you tell those people that we're raising taxes." So Rehoboam goes out and he says, "My father whipped you with a whip. I'm going to whip you with a scorpion." And it split the kingdom. So the young men said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the capital, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. And let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. So Xerxes, Ahasuerus, comes back from the battle of Salamis, and he is angry. And he's depressed. He's angry because he lost his whole army, and he's depressed because he's thinking, what am I going to do now? Keep in mind, he not only had an anger problem, he also had a pride problem. What's he going to do when he goes back to all those guys that funded his army? What's he going to do to all those generals that survived the attack? How's he going to save face? So he was angry and he was depressed. And over time, the anger subsided. You see that up here in verse 1. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, it never says that his depression went away. So what's he looking for in a queen? He has a harem. He doesn't have any problem dealing with sexual favors. What's he looking for? Now, at least a decade before all this stuff, there's Mordecai and there's Hadassah, there's Esther. A decade or more ahead of this, she's going to be selected for the beauty pageant. But before all this, we read, "There was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite." Now, I put in coincidentally because there's no coincidence in this book. I just put that in there and I crossed it out. There was a Jew, and I put in there, who knew. When did Mordecai's identity come out? We know that in the sequence of events, Mordecai tells Esther, don't tell anybody you're a Jew. Esther becomes a member of the harem. She didn't tell anybody she was a Jew. Esther becomes the queen, and she didn't tell anybody she was a Jew. In the meantime, Haman becomes second to the king, and now Mordecai is not going to bow to Haman. Did Haman know he was a Jew? Mordecai was never rewarded for telling about the assassination plan. Was he never rewarded because he was a Jew? We're going to find as we read here how Haman found out that he was a Jew. There was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Now I highlighted 2 Samuel 16, verse 5 and going. That's a passage that deals with Absalom's revolt against David. And David is leaving Jerusalem, and there's this guy named Shimei, who is a brother of Saul, who is throwing stones and cursing David. Mordecai is a direct descendant of Saul, who wiped out the Amalekites. When Haman finds out who Mordecai is, did Mordecai tell the folks just that he was a Jew? Or did Mordecai give away his bloodline? And when that bloodline got to Haman, did that put him into uber anger? We don't know. Now, this is a tricky verse, because if you read it, you could say that Mordecai, son of, et cetera, was taken away from Jerusalem. But you can't read it that way, because that would make Mordecai well over 100 years old. And if he was well over 100 years old, he was not going to be in a very good position to take care of Hadassah as he was raising her up. So let's take a look at the verse. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. There was one other woman that is ascribed that in the book of Esther, and that was Vashti. And so are the young men, the ones that are given the king counsel, looking to find a body like Vashti's body? Or are they looking to find something more? A young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the city, in the custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken. She didn't volunteer. She was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women, and put in custody. She was not allowed to jailbreak. She was brought there against her will, and she was put there in the custody. And the young woman pleased Hegai and won his favor. You can see that, and win his favor so many different times. Be winsome and winsome. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem, but in the harem nonetheless. So you got 127 virgins plus another 7 that are there as attendees, all waiting their turn to please the king. Now, I never saw an episode of this, but there used to be a television show called The Bachelor. And every once in a while, they would film the women and how they were, I guess the only word I could use is catty, trying to position themselves to win that guy. Well, I don't know if these ladies were there catty to try to win the king, but they certainly had their 12 months to have the calluses taken care of and be put into the proper shape. Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day, Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. What a great guardian she had. So first of all, he gave her a command, said, don't let anybody know that you're Jewish. And he made sure that she was okay. And when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations of the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months of spices and ointments for women. Now, I heard this story. I'll tell you what, if I ever walked through a department store, I couldn't tell you the last time I walked through a department store, but if I ever walked through a department store past the counter where they have the perfumes and everything, I just immediately go to sneezing and carrying on. And I heard this, I don't even know if this is so, but if these perfumes have different kinds of names like seduction or intimacy. And the story is told about a young girl going and shopping with a perfume and they offer these things. And she said, I just want them to help me with my homework. So here are these ladies, 12 months, getting themselves all prepped to become beautified. And we already heard where Esther was already beautiful. I'm sure she went through the rigors. She was given the cosmetics. She was compliant. She did what Haggai had to say. And when the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. Now, if these ladies were told, if you win the beauty pageant, you're going to be queen, they're going to try their very, very, very best to win. So what kinds of clothing would they take? What kinds of makeup would they put on? What kinds of perfume would they want themselves to smell like? In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz. In other words, one is taken at a time, spends the night with the king, and then goes to a different room, a different harem, maybe a different building. So there are no communications of what happened or what worked and what didn't work or whatever. So you can see the 127 in one building and none in the other. And over time, the 127 is shrinking and the 127 are over here. We're going to see an interesting phrase at the very bottom of this particular verse. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem, to the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would go into the king again. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not so good with names. In fact, I've learned to call everybody in my family that's a male cool dude because the name doesn't come to me fast enough. And I call all the ladies in my family, except my wife, I've got her name down pat after 48 years. I call all the girls sis because the name doesn't come to me fast enough. I have a brother, Thomas, and my dad, he wanted one of us, it would come out of his mouth, Jamas, because he couldn't think of it fast enough. But for that young lady to go back, she needed to be called by name. So how was King Ahasuerus going to remember Esther's name across 127 women? When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asks for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch who had charge of the women, advised. So here's this guy. He's a eunuch. His desires are not there. His thoughts are not there. If they were there, they're long since gone. She already won his favor. And she's saying, hey, guy, what do you think is best? And so whatever he says, that's what she's going to do. Now, Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Now, this begs the question, what did Esther do that night? When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 12th month, which is the month of Tebeth in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. What does the word love mean there? Did she satisfy him better than the other women? If she did, then that is this huge blot on her character. My contention is that Esther did not sleep with the king before she became the queen. Well, how does she do that? If the king is sitting there, he just finished his dinner, he's waiting for the latest version to come in the door. How do those girls, how do they approach him? So what do? Does Esther fight? King could say, go kill this one, right? Do you lay there like just a dead heap? King might say the same thing. This one's worthless, throw her out.
Yeah.
And if she did something like that, why would he love her? Samson was involved with many women, but it wasn't until the last one. After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. He didn't love the other ones.
No.
He loved this one.
Right.
And so my contention is Ahasuerus loved her for a reason other than sex. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Proverbs 6, do not desire her beauty in your heart, and do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. You think about the eyes of a young girl before puberty, their eyes of innocence, eyes of beauty. When they turn that corner and they start learning the old nature, their eyes are very powerful. And how did some of these women use their cosmetics? Some people use cosmetics for seduction, and others simply to enhance the looks of their faces. We talk about the clothing that the other ladies wore. Some ladies, I've heard it said three things. Some women dress for their husbands, some women dress for other men, and some women dress for God. My contention is that Esther, first of all, dressed for God, and second of all, her makeup was enhancing her beauty. She was given cosmetics. And I think she came to the king with all the respect, with her eyes to the ground. She was winsome, and she won him. And I think they spent the evening having a dialogue. Call me crazy, but that's what I think. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So, what kind of a woman was Esther? First of all, she was beautiful. Chapter 2, verse 7b. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. Second, she was chaste and moral. Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. She was a virgin. She had grace and charm, and the young woman pleased the eunuch and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. She was obedient, she showed restraint, and she showed control. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. She was modest and she was authentic. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her, and I believe she won the favor of King Ahasuerus, who saw her as well. She was winsome. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight. And she had respect for authority. As we study the book of Esther, every time she addresses the king, even though he was her husband, even though she was a queen for several years, she always showed respect to her husband and her king. Verse 19. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, now that's an interesting phrase that I had not seen before. Does that mean he went through the 127 virgins the second round? Could it be, when we think of the phrase that she needed to be summoned by name, could it be that as he went through all those girls, he kept Esther in the back of her brain, but could not remember the name? Maybe he never even asked her name. Maybe he wasn't really sure. But the women were gathered for a second round, and Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. The Bible says the children should obey their parents in the Lord, and that does not end at age 18. She was an adult, and she still obeyed Mordecai. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan, meaning gift of God, he thought he was a gift of God, and Teresh, strictness, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Well, that raises an interesting question. Were they hanged with a rope, or were they impaled on a stake? We just read Esther 2, verse 23. They were both hanged. That word hanged comes from a Hebrew word talah, which means to suspend or to hang up. Then you see this interesting verse in Ezra. Also, I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a dunghill. A different Hebrew, a different word, and this is mechah, and it means to strike into pieces or to impale. You see, the Persians invented crucifixion, not just the tying onto a cross or the nailing through the hands, but impaling the body, as you see from some of this artwork. And some interesting verses. We just read from Ezra chapter 6. We see in Daniel that the stone that struck, or the stone that impaled the image or stayed the image, became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Also in Daniel, all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand, and none can hold back his hand, and none can, 4:2-3, impale his hand. Well, they impaled Jesus' hand, but they didn't hold him back. They didn't stay him. He died, he was buried, and he rose again. Now let's take a look at the word for hanged. It's used plenty of times when people were being hanged. Job 26 says this: he stretches out the north over the void and hangs the earth on nothing. Psalm 137, on the willows there we hung our lyres. They didn't strike a nail through it to hang it, they just hung it in the branches. The Song of Solomon, your neck is like the Tower of David, built in rows of stone. On it hang 1,000 shields, all of them shields of warriors. And Ezekiel, they hung their shields on your walls all around. They made perfect your beauty. It's indecisive, it's inconclusive rather, whether these guys were hanged or impaled. And it doesn't matter. The question here is, the opportunity here is for us to study and learn more of God's word.